Today's topic all about quoting customers. Absolutely. All right, good stuff. So, quoting customers. All right, this is a very broad topic, right? There's a lot that goes into quoting. What I wanted to start with, and when we kind of designed the flow of today's episode, was let's start with talking about the spot market versus the contract market, because there are two big different ways that you're going to probably quote a customer. It's going to be on a load that's got to move today, spot market, or you might be putting a bid price in for an RFP, which is a request for pricing. You might hear it called a RFQ, right? Request for quotation. There's all different kinds of ways that they'll name these bids or these pricing requests. They call them like proposals. It's, there's all kinds of stuff. But we have to differentiate the spot market versus the contract market. So let's talk contract first, because I think the majority of freight that moves, not that we touch as brokers, but the majority of freight that moves is typically in that contract space. And what that means is, and forget about the COVID nuances right now and how the supply chain has shifted. Just go back to the normal marketplace before COVID, when the majority of freight was put on annual bids from these large shippers, right? So once a year, typically, I would say around October. So in their last quarter, they're getting ready to do their bid for the next calendar year, right? And they will send out to all of their registered transportation providers, and that is going to be a lot of asset-based carriers, and there's going to be some brokers in there too that are approved to hop in on their bid. And they'll send out a list of all of their lanes, and it could be, depending on the size of the company, it could be 40 lanes, it could be 3,000 lanes. And I've seen the 1,000+ lane bids, and they are overwhelming. But the way that the contract market works, everybody sends their pricing in. There might be a second phase where you get to go back and sharpen your pencil a little bit and offer a more competitive bid, or maybe decide, you know what, I don't want to bid on these lanes anymore. Anyway, at the end of the day, that company will award contracted lanes to those providers based on their criteria of maybe a mix of price, previous service history, what it could be, a whole bunch of stuff. So that is the contract world. So then what happens is, when those loads move the next year, they're just automatically sent right out to that carrier or that broker to move at that rate that they contracted and agreed to. And the majority of the time, they get it covered, all good. Typically about 10% of the time, they'll say, you know what, we actually can't follow through on this. We're going to send it back to the customer, and they're going to have to find another way to move it. Did I miss anything on the big picture of the contract world that you want to add?
I'd say two big things that I don't want to say left out, but I want to stress. One is, traditionally, these are shippers directly contracted with asset trucking companies. And why that is the case is that, like, asset companies, right? And if you think contract, another way to think about the criteria is think predictable when you think contract, right? When you think broker and spot, think flexible. So contract, predictable, right? The best candidate to be able to predict what they're willing to run work for on a 12-month basis, right, is a truck that has their own fixed costs, right? They know how many drivers they have. They know where their drivers already have customers, so they know where they're going at portions of the week. They know which back hauls they still need, and they know which front hauls they need for other assets that they own and have, right?
Yep.
So it's a very predictable business model from the trucking side. They're like, hey, we've got this fixed number of people and equipment, and these are the lanes that we would work. This is based on fuel. And remember, like, when you own an asset company, like, you know your truck lease, you know your cost per driver per mile, right? The only variable, you know your insurance, you know all your office expenses. The only real variable is fuel. And that's why when you see in bids, there's usually a variable for fuel, so that even though they put their number in, they can adjust for that flexibility, because that's the only variable usually an asset company needs to put into this contract, right?
Yeah, and they'll call that the fuel surcharge, and
yep.
that customer might give you a schedule of their surcharge. So what that does is it says, hey, if diesel prices are between $3 and $3.06 per gallon, you're going to get an extra 19 cents per mile. Right? I'm just making that up. I'm not looking at one right now, but that's typically how they work. And it'll have that entire range all the way down to like where there's no surcharge. So if it's like $2 a mile or $2 a gallon or whatever.
So you got this predictable side of the asset company. So what you tend to see is a lot of the bigger companies, even the smaller companies, right, that work regionally. That's why when a broker, and we'll get to that in a minute, when they try to cover a load for a shipper and they go, well, the open market is way more expensive than what this guy wants to pay. It's because traditionally most of the freight moves with predictable asset-based trucking companies.
Yep.
Now, to your point, that 10%, where that number is right now, which is literally the amount of tendered loads that are given back to the shippers by trucking companies that said they would commit to it, right?
Yep.
Is right now it's like 27 or 30%.
Yeah,
so like
I think
one in
metric,
3 loads.
The metric that I think FreightWaves uses is the ORTI, right? The Outbound Tender Rejection Index. And you're right, it's between 20 and 30%, which means instead of just 1 out of 10 loads being sent back, it's now 2 to 3 out of 10. That's huge.
Now,
that means that there's 2
to
3 times as much freight out there that is now going to leave the contract world and move to what we're going to talk about next, which is the spot market. And one other thing I want to add, I know you said it's primarily asset-based carriers and the contract world. I don't have the exact percentage, but I think it's somewhere between like 60 and 80% ends up being awarded to those contract carriers or offered to those contract asset-based carriers, and the rest may fall into a small group of brokers that are allowed to bid on it too. So.
Right. Now, here's 2 other caveats, right? Like, larger brokerages tend to compete with the asset companies on these bigger bids. And why they're able to is because they have larger carrier bases within their customers, because they just have more customers, and they have lanes that they are already dedicated with like their carrier base. So let's say like I'm a broker at CH, right? I might have a large company we'll call like Dole Pineapple. And let's just say I move 85 loads a week for them. And let's say out of those 85, 30 of them go to the same trucks in the same lanes every single week, right? Well, now, even though I'm not an asset company, I know my drivers that work for me week in and week out also want some backhauls to go back where they were going to pick up from. So now I can give my carriers what they want. They give me a below open market rate, less than what it would cost to cover it that day in the spot market. And now I can compete with the asset companies as a brokerage.
Yep.
So this is the normal trajectory. As your broker gets bigger and your carrier base expands, as you start booking more consistent regular drivers to run the same loads for you, you can now start predicting by being able to bid on contract freight. It will typically be lower margin than what you make in the spot market, but that's how you build some of that consistent revenue into your book of business. It's not going to be at 20% margins or even 15. Maybe it's 10 or 11%. Maybe it's 9. But you know the driver, so there's no risk. You don't have a lot of work posting. You don't have to cover them. All you're doing is distributing the loads and having your team make sure nothing goes wrong as they deliver them. So it's way less touch, way less work, but it's predictable.
I was going to say, so the benefit of having brokers in a contract world is because people typically think, oh, broker, that you're adding one more layer of margin, it's going to cost more. That's not necessarily true, and you just outlined why, right? We as brokers have a much further reach into the market, right? We don't just have access to the 500 trucks in this fleet. We have access to the hundreds of thousands of trucks that are out there if we have the relationships established. And by having that reach, we can reduce the amount of empty miles that a truck has to drive, and we can put, this same lane, it doesn't have to be the same carrier every single time that lane runs. We can plug and play as needed. So
yes. So another way to look at this, right, is when a broker takes a contracted lane, they have the ability to go to the open market if the truck expected to pick it up can't. An asset company does not have that authority. They cannot go to the open market. So think about like an analogy I heard somebody use. It's like a pickup game in basketball. Somebody shows up with their team. They know who plays what role. They have a certain amount of people. The other coach can pull from anybody in the community and just go, hey, sub somebody in. Somebody gets hurt, bring anybody in that can play ball that meets the requirements we can play, right?
Yep.
So it's a deeper bench, right? They literally have access to the whole community or the whole market, where the asset side only has what they know they have. That number doesn't change unless they buy another truck and hire another driver.
You're absolutely right. And the risk to a carrier just trying to grow too fast, they don't have enough business to keep their trucks all moving, and they have empty miles in there or drivers sitting idle. it's going to really, really dig into their profit. So, all right, that's the contract side. Now let's talk the spot market, right? And this is where primarily, as a new freight broker, this is going to be where you spend all of your time. You're prospecting, not what can I contract for the next year, but what is available right now? What problem loads are out there that I can work on, that I can help solve a customer's problem and get this load moved for them?
So hold on one second, because I want to define problem, because we get asked this a lot. So the problems you're trying to uncover with a prospect, a shipper you're speaking to, are the ones we just described from the contract market. You are trying to ask questions to determine which of their contracted carriers gave them a load back. Which of their contracted carriers give them the same loads back every week? Which of their contracted carriers have taken or committed to lanes that they just don't have the capacity for? So you're basically prodding to find the holes left by the contracted carriers so that you can, in a shorter amount of time, fill the gap that the asset company is not able to.
You're absolutely right. Now, when it comes to pricing, think about this. When you price for a contract rate, like for an entire year or a whole quarter, you're going to give one price and commit to that for the entire time, right? Now, when you're going to quote on a spot load, so a load that's available right now that has to pick up today or tomorrow, you are subjected to whatever's going on in the market, not just today, but this hour, right? Because stuff can change throughout the day, not just day to day, but within a specific day. So the cost to hire a truck at 10 a.m. today versus 4 p.m. tomorrow can be ridiculously. It could be off by $1 a mile or $2 a mile, depending on how urgent this load is, or if there's if there's actually any legitimate trucks in the area, or if you've got to hire somebody to drive 200 miles empty just to get to your pickup. There's a lot of variables that go in here. So you want to talk about kind of your rate versus date concept? I know this is a big part of the spot market that you've done a really good job at explaining in the past.
Yeah, and I just try to think of it as like there's always two extremes of any situation, right? The far extreme on one end is a shipper that needs a load picked up in the shortest amount of time possible. So we can either say a day, but you'll see this as you're prospecting. Your customers or prospects will tell you like, hey, this is a hot load, right? That means from their point of view, it is the highest priority. And even with a hot load, you will reach a position or point where like it needs to go out in the next hour, maybe in the next 45 minutes, maybe in the next 2-3 hours, right? So those are your extremes. That is a scenario, right, where the date matters way more than the price or the rate, right? So they're very, very date time sensitive. It's urgent, right? The whole other side of this spectrum is the other side, which is, hey, and typically pre-COVID, these commodities were like bricks. Even lumber to some degree there was just always enough of these commodities on both sides of the supply chain that there was never an incentive to pay any more than the going rate for the contract rate to get them moved. Why? Yeah. Because they just never needed those commodities on the other end urgently. There's enough there and there's enough here. Keep it moving from one side to the other, but it never becomes a last minute urgent situation. And that variable, how urgent it is what's going to determine how high your margin is. The more urgent, the more they're going to be willing to pay, the more work there is for you, and the more risk there is. The more you fall on the other side.
I want to stress that you just brought up, the pre-COVID thing with building commodities and building materials. So many times I would see brokers that you get a lot of these like brick or lumber or whatever kind of shippers that they're positioned in a way where they're going to have like 500-mile runs, right? And probably $2 a mile on average. So they're going to pay $1,000 and they're not going to budge at all. They're going to pay $1,000. They're telling you how much they're going to pay for it. And I would see brokers that are covering it for $950, $960, $955. So you get brokers that their business model was, I'm just going to do a high volume and make like 4 or 5%, just consistently over and over. And they could get by on that if they had a large enough volume and their cash flow could support it. That is not how the market is right now, though. But that is how things were in the past in a lot of those building material commodity shippers. So, But anyway.
And that's another, but I think that's another important thing because we get asked this a lot. Like, where should my margins be, right? I worked with two of our clients yesterday on this very topic. Was when you look at your whole brokerage, right? It's a blended rate of all of your customers. So it's important to know what that is, and it's important to know what that is as a function of really what your profit margin needs to be. Like, you should also know how much you need to make to cover all of your fixed costs per load. To know what that number is that you have to be above before you're even profitable. Because maybe 5% is enough. Maybe your operating expenses are 5%. So maybe like you need 8 to even earn 3. So the first thing I would say is know that number, what your cost is on a monthly basis divided by your average amount of loads run. That'll give you that number. But the more important caveat is like when you get into margin, right, which is really just the dollar equivalent of risk for a brokerage and a shipper, right? That's what you're pricing in. You know, the closer you are to urgent, like if I got a customer that needs us picked up this morning, I'm going to tell them flat out, like, I'm going to go tell you what the market is at right now. I'll tell you the range I think I'm going to pay. But if you really need this, I'll get you the truck, but I don't know what it's going to cost. I'm going to come back and I'm going to add a margin for my time. And that's what the cost is going to be. But if they're going to give me a couple other days, then okay, we'll try to get you that cheaper truck every day. And if you're telling me it's got to get out by Friday, well, by Friday, then it becomes a, urgent load. So these are the conversations you're having with your prospect to determine really what rate you're going to bring back. Because everyone goes like, how do I come up with the perfect rate? Well, you only can come up with the perfect rate if you have the context of the situation, right? Without it, and that's where people get into this issue where they're like, they're spending all this time looking through all of this data, whether it be DAT or FreightWaves or any of the information out there. If you haven't asked enough questions from your shipper, you don't know what you're trying to fit in there. You don't know the context. You don't know if it's perfect. You don't know if they want closer to contracted because they're willing to wait or if it's urgent. And I can tell you this, they are not going to just flat out tell you that because that's the hand of poker they're playing. They're telling all their brokers and everybody they work with as much information as they can to get the lowest price that they have to pay. So they're not going to be super forthcoming, which is why trust matters so much to being good at this job because the rate you give them is a function of the information you get, and the information you get is a function of the amount of trust and rapport you have.
So I know that we're going to hit on like tools and stuff here in a little bit, but I wanted to just echo what you said. So there's a reason that DAT and Truckstop, with their rating tools, they omit the upper and lower, like 5%,
bounds,
something like that, because there are going to be those loads that are so urgent that they end up paying 2 to 3x the market rate to get them moved right away, and we don't want that data to be reflected in our rating tools, right? Same thing goes with if you get that ridiculous backhaul that the guy takes it for half the market rate, right? We don't want those outliers to be factored into our overall.
Here's the thing. Yes and no. I'll agree with you and the fact that like they are omitted. Right, but why you don't want them is that you don't want them when you're looking at that information for a contracted or longer term situation, right? That's the only time you really look at that data. If you've got a load you got to cover today, none of that really matters. It only matters for a starting point. What really matters is that 5% that is omitted when you look at the historical data, 3, 7 days, 30 days, 6 months, and a year, right? That helps you to predict, hopefully, the predictiveness of this year. What is it going to be over the next month? The reality is if your customer is telling you they need this picked up today, that shit don't matter at all. What matters is go to the load board, see what the other brokers are posting, because that's the information of the 5% that is omitted in the contract side. So when you look at RateMate, right, and it gives you all of this information, or RateView, right, when you want to find out what it costs to cover it today or this morning, that 5% that is emitted over there, you will find by looking at the open market, what freight brokers are posting that load for right now, and by posting up this load to see what carriers bring back to you.
So let's kind of get into some of those tools. So we mentioned, I'll tell you the 3 that I've worked with primarily: RateMate from Truckstop, RateView from DAT, and most recently Sonar from FreightWaves. And the way that they get their data is important, and if you're looking at a rating tool, I highly encourage you to ask whoever you're looking at, where is your data coming from? How do I know that this is accurate information? And how do you omit the upper and lower 5%, right? Ask those questions and figure that out. The reason being, if a company just says, we kind of look at, yada yada yada, and this is where we get our rates from. It's like, well, we need concrete evidence. So, like, for example, DAT, right? If a company has, if they financially process transactions, they have verified rates. So if you have a factoring company that is part of your company's umbrella, that is real information, right? You're going to actually see what a broker paid a carrier for on that lane. That's real data. For example, Sonar from FreightWaves, it's a very, very expensive tool, but it's a really cool one if you're an analytics person. They have a co-op of like 25 mega brokerages in the country that all share their data every 24 hours, and they have within a 24-hour actual data set of data points there. Whereas usually like DAT, you're going to see 3 days, which is still fairly good, but that's 3-year-old data, and even 1-day-old data. There's going to be fluctuation up and down from whatever you're looking at. So,
yeah.
But I like how you brought up looking at what other brokers are posting their loads for, because that's a great tool that a lot of people, they don't use, right? And not every single load board license will give you access to do that. Mm-hmm. I know DAT Power, which is what I use, I can go search and see what other loads are posted. And then on TruckStop, I believe it's TruckStop Pro. I don't use TruckStop as much as DAT. But if you have the right license out there, you're going to be able to see what other brokers are posting your loads for. And that will give you a live set of data that'll tell you this is what other brokers are asking for on this. And the reason that a lot of brokers will post a rate with their load board posting is it gets more visibility, right? A carrier is more likely to sort their load search from highest to lowest pay, and then they're gonna look at like, okay, well, how far is it from where I am now? How far do I have to drive empty? And they'll kind of factor that stuff in. And with capacity as competitive right now as it is, brokers need to stand out if all they're going to do is post a load on a load board. So, just some food for thought there on using
Another
the load
good
board in that sense.
I think there was also a really good analogy I saw in the news this morning. Obviously, the stock market has been fluctuating a ton over the past 2 days, right? And there was a graph that really explained how all markets function. I think it's really appropriate here, right? It was the S&P was down like 9% yesterday, and it kind of came back. It was down like 9% yesterday and came back up. But the graph was, and like everybody gets all worried, like, oh, what is this doing in a day, right? But the reality is that most people that have their money in the stock market have it in there until retirement. Long-term investments. And that's exactly what they said. They're like, hey, yeah, it might be down 10%, but over the past 5 years, it's up 90%. So this isn't really relevant unless you are a day trader or trying to make money scalp trading on a daily basis. If you're leaving your money in there, just like in the contract market, if you're willing to wait long enough, the variability in the short run doesn't matter. And that's why you spend time looking at historical data, right? What has the chart look like over time?
See, it's like not timing the market, but time in the market, right?
Exactly.
So,
yep.
Interesting analogy to freight brokering. But think about that on the contract side, right? Those contract rates that are the same that they've agreed to all year, they're going to have loads or lanes on certain days where they make a ton of money because capacity costs them a little bit less, right? And then on the flip side, they're going to take hits.
Well, and that's an important point. When you really look at these bids, and you've worked in them as well as I have, when you go through these hundreds of lane bids, you're basically pricing in on what a year looks like. And a year does not look like this if you look at it on a graph. A year looks like this, right? It goes up and down based on the volatility. But your price is set as a flat line. So if you've got this line, when the market looks like this, maybe you're not doing so well. But when it's like this, you're doing very well. So when you price in this, right, why you see bigger companies do this as opposed to newer ones is you don't have enough information and you don't have enough predictable carriers. So you can't really guess what it's going to cost you to cover this lane every week all year. And COVID and everything that's happened, right, we've just got more volatility. Which is why, back to our early explanation, why you're seeing 27%, upwards of 30% of loads given back. Because an asset company that booked a load for $2.75 a mile just gives it back if they can get $3.50 a mile in the spot market. Because there's no repercussions. There's no legal penalties. Nobody sues anybody. The only repercussion is they might not give you that load the next time you bid it next year. And that's really the only risk when you don't pick up loads for a shipper.
So one of the the last things I wanted to talk about with pricing here is, so if you look at RateView, right, and you get that range, and it's usually, I don't know, you might see like a couple $100 range. So you might see like, oh, this lane is somewhere between 3,300 and 3,700, right? And that's just a random example. When you talked about rate versus date, if your customer wants the correct, that they're very price sensitive, that price range will give you an idea of where the market is, but you're not going to find a truck right now within that range, right? You can tell your customer, communicate with them, hey, if you give me some time to work on this, I can probably get you a truck somewhere around this range, right?
Yep.
Whereas if this is urgent and it has to go right now, like you said before, I don't know what it's going to cost you. I can go find you a truck and I'll let you know what that price looks like. And that's where you can't just predict it right away. You've got to go out there and actually talk to carriers.
And people always ask, like, what do you say when you're prospecting? This is the conversation. The specific words don't matter. It's getting this point across is, hey, I'm on the phone, I'm role playing. Hey, okay, so, Jimmy, you guys, your target rate on this is 2,100. All right, let me take a look at this. I'll get back to you. I'm going to go look at two pieces of information, right? RateView and see what the historical is. And it'll probably be, if he's telling me it's 2,100, I'm guessing historical is probably like 2 to 2,400, right? Somewhere in there. He wants to be on the lower end of that. And probably he pays a little bit more, so he's going to bluff a little lower, which is pretty standard. Okay, now I look at the spot market, and to cover that load today, let's say it's $3,000, right? Plus my margin, so call it $3,400, $3,500, right? I'm going to call him back and go, hey, Jimmy, right? Like, I'm looking at the market. Looks like it's about, and I got to get my margin in there, so even if it's 2 to 24, it looks like it's 23 to 26. I know you guys want to be at 21. I can try, but this looks like where it is. To be honest, if you need a truck today, the market looks like it's at about 3,500 today. I know that's above where you want to be. Then I'm going to ask him, hey, do I have a few days to work on this? Do you need to get this out this week? Do I have 4 or 5 days? Because I can probably get you a truck close to your rate if I've got enough time to work on it. There's probably a truck that needs this backhaul if I post it consistently and really work it. And I'm going to let him answer. I'm going to not say anything. I'm going to hit mute and then just wait. He's going to tell me like, oh no, you either have a couple days or I need to get it out today. Okay, then my next question is, are you willing to pay this if I have a truck, right? And if he tells me no, he's got to be at that rate, then guess what I'm not going to do? I'm not going to spend all day calling every truck that is posted where that pickup is, because they're not going to run it for the average. They're going to want the 3,100 or 32 or more. So you know very quickly in these conversations where your efforts will be once you get off the phone with your prospect. Am I just going to post it up? Then that's all you should do. If he's not willing to pay what it costs to get it moved today, the only effort you should be putting forward is posting that load up on a daily basis and seeing if you get a truck, because you're never going to convince somebody to run it for the predictable, consistent basis when they only need it once.
Yep. Good discussion. So that's pricing in a nutshell. That we didn't get too specific on any part of it. We don't have enough time to do that in one episode, but hopefully that sheds some light for those of you that are asking about pricing. So we got